Okay, so yeah, so like I was saying, if you want to download some of the content that I have available to you, great. You can download it here. While this downloads, I'm going to tell you a little story, and hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll have the materials with you as well, because it might take a couple of minutes for you to download it. It's about 60 megs or so, two PDF documents. So, so we're here to talk about a project that I've been working on for a couple of years now, that is very near and dear to my heart, which is related to how we can help development teams build accessible content for everybody else. So I just need to gauge who I'm talking to today to make sure that the angle is relevant to you. So how many of you actually work in developing or designing websites? Are you involved in any of that work? Kind of? You are? Tufik, you are? Okay. How many of you are students here? You're working in the web, student in web development? Okay, great. And how many of you are faculty staff members for the university? Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you. Those who haven't raised your hands, who are you?
I'm IT director in a cosmetic manufacturing company in Lebanon.
Okay. Okay, great. How about you?
I'm an educator trainer and I run off my own business in education.
Okay, so educator and then your business.
Yes.
Perfect. Anybody else?
Yeah. Hi, I'm the social media and communications specialist at AUB.
Okay, awesome. And anyone else?
I'm Stephanie, the head of academic coordination at we design online courses.
Okay, awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to do this a little differently than I would have done if I was talking to a group of designers, developers, content creators. But the resource is hopefully going to be helpful to you, and hopefully you're in a session where we talk about creating inclusive training materials, so this is something that you're interested in. So before I get into that, I want to share something with you, like explain where this comes from and why I'm talking about this today. So, how many of you were in my session yesterday? A couple of you were? Okay. So I come from pretty long background of design and development. I started in 1997 building websites, and around 2000 I discovered accessibility by accident. And by accident, what I mean is that I was working as a developer, a lead developer, fixing problems for my team, basically, trying to understand why things would not work in a certain browser, Netscape 3 at the time. And if you don't know what Netscape is, that's a very ancient version of Firefox. Let's put it this way. And one day, a project manager comes to me and says, we just won this project to redesign the website for an hospital in Montreal, Canada, where I'm from. But the website needs to be accessible to blind people. Figure something out, because we have no idea what to do here. Like, and you know, like I for myself, I'd never even thought about the fact that someone who was blind would use a computer. That was something that was completely out of my vision, so to speak. So very quickly I started going online and I discovered, and we were, like, Google didn't really exist at the time even, so we're talking Alta Vista and Northern Lights, so very old search engines that no longer exist. And I discovered these web accessibility guidelines, version 1.0, that had been adopted the year before, 1999. Actually, like in December of 1999, so it was like not even 6 months later. So by complete accident. And it changed my mind. It changed my life. As of that moment, designing and developing websites became something that had a purpose, because now it was not just about putting some company's content online, but it was actually helping people access that content in a way where they could be autonomous. And because you're all much younger than I am, back then the web was pretty simple. You had pages with text, a couple of images, maybe you had a table every now and then, no interaction except for clicking on links. It was very, very simple. So creating accessible content was pretty straightforward. It was not very complicated. And then of course, with the evolution of different languages like JavaScript and interactivity in general, it became more and more complex with animations, with videos, with all these other things. It became pretty complex over time. And the more the web became complex, the harder it was to create accessible content because all these barriers would now come in your way. Adding images, adding videos, adding animations, all these different things, if they're not being described visually, someone who can't see doesn't get that information. If you can't use a mouse and you have to navigate through a bunch of different controls, and it's not made to be working also with a keyboard, you can't navigate through those things. Tufik yesterday was talking in a presentation that he did, was talking about the main issues that we find on websites out there. And color contrast is another one of those things. I mentioned being colorblind yesterday. So when it comes to color blindness and my ability to distinguish a link from a paragraph of text, if it's not underlined, sometimes it's difficult. And if I'm under pressure because I'm talking to a client, for instance, and I'm looking for this link and I can't find it, if it's like just one word in a paragraph, I might completely miss it because I'm stressed out and I'm not as focused as I would be otherwise. So just examples of issues that we run into with time. So fast forward a couple years, and I work as a consultant. So I work with organizations who want to figure out how to make their content accessible. They don't know how, and no one really feels accountable for this. So they're all just saying, well, somebody else will do it, not me, please, not me, but somebody else will take care of it here. And what happened was that people were trying to create accessible websites that way, but they were not very successful. But they were trying, for the most part. They just weren't successful doing it. So after a while, a couple of years, after I had seen so many clients try really hard and fail at doing this well, and those clients being frustrated because they had spent all that energy trying to make things accessible, and then people were still saying, well, it doesn't work for me, you didn't do it well, you're bad, and all the comments that can come with it, we had to find a solution to help organizations be better at making accessible content. So this is when a project that we eventually called the Accessible Roles and Responsibilities Mapping Project came together, which is essentially a mouthful to say, a way to break down responsibilities by role. Please come in. So how to break down responsibilities by role. As an example, if I'm talking to you about color contrast, this should not be the responsibility of someone who's a developer. Color contrast, choosing colors for the website, should be a responsibility of a designer, for instance. If I'm talking about the fact that that website needs to be fully operable with a keyboard and not just a mouse, that's not a designer's responsibility. That's really a developer's responsibility because they're coding how that works. So it had never really been thought about before until maybe 2009, 2010. And I started working on this idea that if we analyze every single criterion that exists in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which at that point were version 2.0, and we started giving different people different responsibilities, a different checklist, and they all stick to that, then maybe it would be more accessible. And that worked. It actually worked really well. And over the years, things like that were adopted. We had a first iteration of that project around 2010, 11. Do you know what the W3C is? Most of you seem to know. For those of you who don't know, W3C stands for the World Wide Web Consortium. It's a group of companies that come together to develop web standards for the web. So this is where you develop standards like HTML, CSS, XML, accessibility, all these different things. So think of it like Switzerland for technology, for web technologies. This is a neutral place, theoretically neutral. Theoretically not political, but it's everything, it's just political. But I mean, it's a place where all these companies come together and they decide how technologies work for the web. I'm one of the invited experts to conversations about that when it comes to accessibility. So this project is part of what we do over there. And so over the years, we developed this really long list of all the things you need to think about when you're creating an accessible website, based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but in a language that is a lot easier to understand. Because, as sad as that may be, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are not written for people like us. They're written for technologists. They're written for, in a way that, sort of helps you understand from a legal standpoint what you need to do. It's a very technical set of documents. And if you're not familiar with that, understanding what they actually mean is really hard. And as a result of that, adoption was never really good. Except for people like Tufik, who would like to read stuff like that and develop an expertise around these things. Most people don't do that. So the goal was to translate all that content into something that was much more understandable. Over time, that became a series of a checklist, again, of things to think about if you are a front-end developer, a UX designer, UI designer, content creator, so on and so forth. So what I want to share with you today is a glimpse of what that is. So, because again, we're talking about creating training materials for accessibility, role-based training materials. So part of what I want to show you is that. So this is the genesis of that project. But also what you could download if in that URL there, which are 2 PDF documents that I also want to show you, that could also help with either one, developing training materials, if that's what you want to, as an educator for instance, if that's what you want to do, then you could start building training materials that are specifically targeted for, say, designers, so that what you teach them is relevant to them, or understand with using these documents here how you could look at delivering this training material that you have. So if you want to educate other people and you want to be mindful, welcome, you want to be mindful of disabilities, for instance, how might you share this information with others so that they feel included as well? So it's a mix of those things that we're going to be looking into together today. So again, before I remove this from the board here, and especially if you just joined, welcome. You can download materials that I have available at that URL. So that's https://bit.ly, so bit.ly/able-2023. It's a rather big zip file, 60 megs or so it takes a couple of minutes. And you have 2 PDFs in there that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. Okay, so having said all that, are we all good with the program, roughly, what we want to talk about? Is this relevant to you? If there's anything that you want to ask, please don't wait until the end. Just raise your hand, ask a question. If we can make that interactive, that'd be awesome. So feel free to ask those questions. If you want to go in a slightly different direction than the one that I'm going into, please again raise your hand and ask that question, because I want this to be about you, not about me. So let's make sure that you get value out of this today. Okay, so having said all that, this here, so I'm going to be sharing that link a little later because it's a rather more complicated link, but this link here is the link to that other resource I'm about to show you. So we're not going to even try to do that right now because it's not going to work, but if you can take a picture of it, that would be perfect. Just remember that I broke it so that it would fit on 2 lines. So there's a dash and then it goes back to ARRM. On that other side there, it's really just 1 line. But what you'll find over there is this resource here. And basically what that resource is, well, most of it is not really interesting because most of it is just context. So here's why it exists, is what you want to do with this. The piece that I think is really interesting to you is a little further down where it speaks to, say, what you can do, how you're going, well, actually let me make that a little bigger here. So how you might look into, say for example, if we're talking about headings and how to use headings in a document, here's how you might look at it from the perspective of a writer, a designer, or a developer, for instance. So as that example, not even looking at that, but just going out of logic, if I'm talking about headings, for instance, and we want to figure out like who's responsible for headings when we're building a website. People will be responsible for different things, right? So a designer might decide that the headings look a certain way. That's their decision. The font's going to be, this size. The color's going to be, it's going to be that color. It's going to be that font face. And main heading levels are going to be look like this, and subheadings are going to look like this. So that's a designer decision, really. But then, from a developer standpoint, making sure that something that looks like this, as opposed to something that looks like this, they are not the same visually. And they're not the same visually because the bigger headings are higher up in that hierarchy. So if I want a developer to convey that this is a subheading and this is a main heading in that document, it's not just making them bigger. Because if I make them bigger, those of us who can see recognize the bigger one, so we say, oh, that's a more important one because it's bigger. But if I'm blind, if I can't see, and they're all just headings, I don't know what the hierarchy looks like. If they're actually not coded as headings, and they're all just text, but the text looks a certain way, then nothing would be conveyed to my screen reader. How many of you are familiar with screen readers? Is that something that so you would be?
I use a screen reader.
Every day?
Online.
Yeah, but I mean you use it every day, right? Yeah, exactly.
I'm studying computer science. So.
Okay, yeah. So NVDA, JAWS?
Yes, NVDA and JAWS.
Both? Okay. So for those of you not familiar, let me just make that very simple for you. This is a web page. So this is just code behind it, and it renders a certain way. You can create things that look like headings, like lists, paragraphs, so on and so forth. There's code behind all of this that marks it up a certain way. So, and we're not going to get into the details of how you do that, but a heading, for instance, the code for a heading is going to be H plus a number, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, or H6. That's your range. So you can have, if you have a H2 in a document, that's a subheading to the main heading, which would be a H1 theoretically. If you have a H4, it supposes that you have a parent that's a H3, which has a parent that's a H2, which has a parent that's a H1. There's hierarchy. So someone using a screen reader, for instance, when they hear a certain heading, if they hear heading level 3, they understand that theoretically, and theoretically here is important because typically it's not done well, so it's not always reliable, but if they hear about a heading level 3, they know that they're in a subsection of a section that should be titled with an H2 inside a page that should have an H1. So you see the hierarchy here, right? So going back to what I was saying, if you're a developer, your responsibility is to turn something that is blue and bold into something that is coded with the proper tag, the proper code behind it. If you have a smaller heading and a bigger heading, this one should have a smaller number, 2 versus 3, for instance. So that's a very specific responsibility for developers that has absolutely nothing to do with what a designer would do. But they're both looking at headings. And then if you think about a content creator, their responsibility when it comes to headings is making sure that whatever text you have there is meaningful enough that when I look at that particular heading and I approach heading like road signs, I understand what will come next. And when all three of those groups do their work properly, someone using a screen reader can look at the entire page with their screen reader, extract all the headings from that page, and get a really nice table of content for the... No problem. So they have a really good table of content for what that page is about. And if the headings are written in a way that makes sense, they can also see which sections are relevant to them and which subsection is interesting to what they're looking for. And when you're blind, with a page that is developed like this, you can navigate through it very, very easily. That's the whole point. But the thing is, that's one example out of hundreds of examples to make your page accessible. We could be looking at, say, images and an alternative text for images, and it's the exact same thing again. If I'm a designer, if I'm a UX designer, for instance, my responsibility might be to determine that this particular image needs to be described in text because it's very meaningful to the understanding of the document, while that other image is really just decorative, and we're not going to describe it because that would just be noise to the screen reader. Like, it's not relevant to describe, like, there's a line here, right? There's a box around this particular piece of text that you may see, it's like light gray, but that box is purely decorative. I don't need to hear about the box text. But if there was an image down here somewhere of a logo or something meaningful like a graph, I would want to be able to hear what that is, otherwise I would miss that information. So that particular piece might be the responsibility of a UX designer. Deciding what the actual alt text value is going to be for that image, like how we're going to describe that image, is not the UX designer's responsibility. It's a content creator's responsibility. It's a content strategist's responsibility. And once that has been determined, it's a developer's responsibility to embed that into the right code, the right piece of code, so that it would work with a screen reader. So again, another example of how accessibility is not the responsibility of one person, but rather the collective responsibility of many people working towards a specific outcome. So this is what this resource is about. So in this particular resource, if I go back to behind the scenes in the wiki that feeds this, and again, I'll be sharing those links with you afterwards, but we have documents over here, core documents. Is this it? Yes, here. Where what we did is we looked at the responsibilities of all 4 of those groups. So UX designers, visual designers, content, front developer. And there are hundreds of those things. I'll show you the bigger list after. But we were thinking, if a content creator is interested in accessibility, the last thing I want is for them to look at 100 different things and be completely disheartened and finding daunting and not really wanting to do it because it looks complicated. So we figured, what are the top things you should think about? Like the top 15 things you should be looking into to get started. Same thing for a designer, same thing for a content creator. So if we look at UX designers, for instance, and we go through that page, what you'll find here is, eventually, I should have clicked on that link up there. Getting there. There we go. Okay. So you've got a list of 15 different things that people should be looking into. As an example, when we think about media controls, like a media player, that particular media player should have the ability to turn sound on or off. So someone needs to think about this, because if you have a player for video, for instance, and the video just autoplays when the page loads, and there's no way to turn off the sound, that would be problematic for someone using a screen reader again, because that audio is going to interfere with the screen reader, and you can't hear the information from your screen reader anymore, so you don't even know what's going on because you can't hear the instructions. Or if someone, let's say you have a child sleeping near you, and the video starts playing all of a sudden, you'd like to be able to turn that off, because at the moment it's not something that you want, the audio, you don't want it. So someone needs to think about something like that. Or so this one here is another good example. The design makes it possible for end users to enlarge the text so that it reflows into a single column without any loss of information or functionality. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what that says basically is that when I have a document like this and I need to really magnify the content, am I going to create this really long horizontal scroll bar where I have to go left and right like I do in this page to be able to read through things? Or will everything stack into a single column with no scroll bar so that I can just read everything into that one interface? Which makes it a lot easier for someone who has low vision, for instance. Because if I can't see the entire page at once, I can do that. Yeah. So if I can see this, that works for me. But if I need something that is big like that, it makes it much harder to read. So the more time I spend doing this, is less time that I can spend cognitively thinking about the content. So it's harder for me to understand what I'm reading because I do a lot of other things at the same time. So if I want to make it easier, this is something that I can do. It's accessibility again. But this is not the responsibility of the content creator. This is the responsibility of a UX designer to think about those things so that they can give the right information to developers so that the developers can actually do it. So I think that's the idea. So that's the setup, if you will. So when we have that understanding, and what we're doing, bringing us back to the entire goal of this presentation, when we go back to the idea of creating training materials, if your goal is to either educate people that work in web development, web design, or you want to create materials for courses that are specifically tailored to people who play a certain role, what I think is that if you begin with a list of 15 things to think about like this, That makes for a really great curriculum of things to teach as a starting point. For those of you who were in my session yesterday, I was talking about progress over perfection, for instance. So how you should not try to get everything right from the very beginning, because there's hundreds of things to think about. You're not going to succeed, you're going to be disheartened, and you're going to say, this is too complicated, I don't want to do that. So instead, do fewer things, but do them well. Do one thing, do two things, do three things, 5 things, 6 things, whatever. Do however many you can, but don't make it too complicated for yourself. And be gracious and accept that you will need time to get good at this. And again, the idea being that if you have a bunch of different people on your web team who all have a list of elements to think about, and they all do that, you progressively become better as a team, and you learn through that, and as you learn, you're ready to bring in more things to consider. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that particular list points back to this document, which is, I'm not even going to try it on this one here because this is really, really big. But this document here, where's my scroll bar? This document here has over 300 of those things in there. Like there's a ton of stuff. Every single, and actually let me just bring it back to the top to help you see that. So what I have here, and I'm going to describe so that she can also see. So the entire document is one big table. Actually, it's 10 different tables together. Every table is a particular topic. So the topics that we have are images and graphs. And then what is this? Hold on a second. We don't want that. So the first item in that list of content is images and graphs, document structure, input modalities, form interactions, CSS and presentation, navigation, data tables, animation and movement, static content, dynamic interactions. So those are 10 content types. Under, say, input methods, input modalities, I will have things about keyboard navigation. If I have a link, I want to be able to go and click on that link, but I also want to be able to take my keyboard using the tab key and then just tab to that link, press the enter button, and trigger the link that way. A different way to use it, different modality. Under images, I'm going to find things about alt text and alternative text for images. Under CSS and presentation, I'm going to have things about color contrast and colors in general, use of color, things like that. Under data tables, I'm going to find things about the fact, for instance, that if you have a table, let's say any one of those here, if we look at this table, it's a rather complex table where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. The first one is labeled with ID. The second one is labeled WCAG SC for success criterion. The other one is conformance level, checkpoint, main role, and then role ownership. And so each one has information underneath. So if I'm using a screen reader again, because the screen reader is a very linear experience, you're going from one object to the other linearly. If I'm going through that and I hear about a particular column that says, for instance, A, I need to know that A actually relates to conformance level. We know that because visually we recognize the association between the two. We can tell just by looking at it that they're related. We see that because there's a different color for the first row at the top there, and then the information is in a column, so we visually see that. But I don't know that information if I can't see. If all I have is my screen reader that's telling me what's going on, I need context, and the context will be provided again through code, developer responsibility. But designing that table to look a certain way so that I can visually recognize this is a designer's responsibility in this case. Anyway, the point behind this being that if you bring all 10 of those different content types together, it's over 300 different things that you have to know to create accessible content. You alone will not be doing that. Or if you do, you'll have a lot of work. But if you have a team working together, you don't want people to spend their energy on things that are not really relevant to them. If you're going to be training them about accessibility, you don't want them to feel like half of what you're saying does not really matter to them, and they're wasting their time. So this is why a resource like this exists. If you're going to create training materials for people who want to learn how to create accessible content, we broke that down in a way where you're only going to be teaching, well, you could decide to only teach certain topics to certain people because that's their job, and you don't waste their time and energy with other things that would not be relevant to them. So that's the idea behind this.
For content creators, what's the most relevant section out of the headings?
For content creators, I would say that static content down here would be a really good one. A couple of examples of what we'd have in here. Let's see this first one here. So emoticons, emojis, ASCII art, and other non-markup language constructs are supported with equivalent text alternatives and conveyed to assistive technologies. So what that means basically is if you're using anything, so do you know what ASCII art is? Probably not.
No.
So you know what an emoji is, right?
Yeah.
Like a semicolon and then paragraph or a smiley.
Yeah.
Take that and then create very complex images using just punctuation to create like an image of a cat. So we look at the entire thing, we see a cat, but if you're having a screen reader, you're hearing semicolon, 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 semicolon like 500 times, and then dot, 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 dot. And that's what you hear. You don't hear image of a cat.
So there's a pattern being created which then makes you know that you take an image of a certain.
Right, right. So what this says here basically is that if you have anything that's like an emoji or ASCII art like that, anything that's visually gives you an information, but it's granularly described with every single component of that image, you need something to describe it as a whole so that you know what this is. Because even if this was this ASCII image of a cat, for instance, all I really need to know is that, oh, it's an image of a cat made with punctuation signs. Okay, maybe that's interesting, but I don't need to know the detail of every single punctuation sign in that particular image. Just like when you're describing an image for accessibility purposes, you might describe a scene where you have two parents and a baby, and they're lovingly looking at their baby, and in the background it's a certain way, but you don't need to describe the color of their shirt and whether or not their hair is brown or black. It's not really relevant. So you focus on the relevant information, so you don't have too much things to say, and it doesn't become overwhelming. So you make these choices. So this is the same idea here.
So here it's basically to sum it up and make it sound relevant by focusing on the relevant stuff.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yes?
So for example, if we like preparing like training for designers on not only on web accessibility, sometimes related to other forms of accessibility that are related to design. If we stick to that design role, can we find everything like we need more or less?
Well, personal opinion.
Yeah.
You find everything that you need to get started.
Yeah.
You find everything that you need to have a solid foundation. There's a ton of other things. But I feel that most of these other things are just a little too complex for now. And if I tell you those things, you're not really going to understand them because you don't have your foundation yet. So the idea is to build that foundation first, make you become good at this, and then we can talk about that other thing that might have flown right over your head 6 months ago, but now you're ready for it because you learned the basics. So that's the idea. This stage here, like I said, has over 300 different things. That's a lot of details. Way too many details for most people. But
Yeah, it's just for example, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I review a lot of media materials, and I always write the comments, not accessible, fix this, fix that. And
Right.
now they're asking for that training, so I'm kind of like, okay, where do I start from?
I think that's a good place to start. Yeah, I think it's a really great place to start. The idea behind this, so for that purpose exactly, so to help everyone benefit from this, but specifically since you have a need with that, I would say, let's take maybe one that's a little easier to work with to begin with. Okay, so this is a perfect one. So this one says heading markup, so the code for headings, is only used for text which actually acts as a section heading. If you're doing assessments, like I am, you know that a lot of people will use heading markup because they want to make something big and bold. Maybe they have a slogan, and they will use a H1 because the H1 naturally makes it big. But it's not a heading, it's just a random sentence. If I depend on headings to understand the structure of your page, then that thing becomes the main heading of the document, but it might not be even related to what the page is about. It's confusing. So I want to make sure when I work with a content creator, for instance, that they understand that anything that relates to a heading should only be assigned to elements that actually work as headings or act as a signpost or a road sign for that document. And I want the content creator to be able to have a conversation with the developer and say, no, don't use that. In that particular case, if you're able to follow me with this, use CSS and, for instance, make the font 200 times as big as the default so that it's bigger, but it's all going to be visual in that sense. And make sure that you're really marking that up as a paragraph because it's not a heading. The opposite would be true if they were using heading, if they had an actual heading in the page, but they only used a paragraph and they styled it to look big and bold, you would say, no, wait, this actually functions as a heading, so it needs to have the semantic, the structure behind it, so that it can be recognized as such for someone using a screen reader. So it's stuff like that. But anyway, getting a little into weeds here. Sorry about that. But so we've got these 300 plus things in there. That's a lot of content. So if we go back to the other page, what we have is this extraction of different, actually one more. We go to this extraction of different links or topics to think about where there's only 15 for devs, content creators, UX designers, and UI designers. So the whole point here is to say, if you have to, well, two things actually. If you are one of those things, if you are interested in, say, becoming a developer or becoming a designer, and you're interested in accessibility also, this is a great place for you to start without feeling overwhelmed. So that's my recommendation to you, is look at this as a way to get started, wrap your head around some of these concepts, and if you do that, you'll become ready to tackle more. And when you are, there's 300 more things waiting for you. So you'll have plenty of other things to look at. So that's the first part. The second part of this, because we're running out of time, relates to the zip file that I shared at the beginning. So I want to show you that. Actually, before I do, I want to quickly introduce what that is. So it's one thing for you to know what to teach, know what to talk about for when it comes to accessibility. It's another thing to actually present it to people in a way that will be inclusive, that will be accessible in that sense. So, and actually, you have something like this already. So in the documents that were shared with us yesterday, you had a little pamphlet. Well, we had two. One of them was about the program. The other one was this one here with a bunch of posters on it. So it's the one called ABLE, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, on the front page. Then everything else is just a series of posters. And those are all do's and don'ts for accessibility. You didn't have that one? It was in my my bag. So I don't know. Maybe I'm happy to give it to you. So this is interesting, as it gives you a couple of pointers again. As an example, I'm going to take just this one here that I have. So this one is about dyslexia. So it says 5 things that you should do to help users with dyslexia. 5 things that you should never do. So do's and don'ts. So as an example, a do would be use images and diagrams to support text. When you think about it, that makes sense. If someone has dyslexia, they have a harder time reading. If you support the text with diagrams, it makes it a little easier. What you should not do, if you're trying to build something that would work better for someone who's dyslexic, don't use large blocks of heavy text. Don't have this really big paragraph of text that I'm supposed to read if reading is difficult for me. If you break that down into smaller paragraphs and you add some visual around it, it makes it much more digestible. So this document does that. The problem with these documents, and they're awesome. I've worked with them for years as an educator. They're really, really good. But they have one problem. They're not specifically designed for the web. A lot of these things, the things in there are just generally speaking about accessibility.
So it's like for any sort of material, whether
Right.
paper-based or print.
Yeah, print or other situations. I'm going to give you an example. One of them is about deafness or hard of hearing. So deaf or hard of hearing, second to last one in the document. This one speaks to, where is it? So the last do and the last don't in that one goes like this. So the do would be let users ask for their preferred communication support when booking appointments. So that could work from a web standpoint. Actually, no, that's not the right example. Yeah, or maybe they changed it since then. Because the don't is don't make telephone the only means of contact for users. So this is good. This is good advice. But there's a version of that, or maybe it's just a different one. But there's one in there that was saying, for instance, offer TTY services, which is like a different way of supporting someone on a phone where they can have the information translated into text for them. So this is great. It's great advice, but it's not web. So wanting to fix that, we worked on different documents also. So what I shared with you at the beginning is two things. Now I need to get to this here. Yeah, but I have I have that thing. Maybe I can. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So what we developed was a series of posters like this. So the idea behind that. So I'm just going to give you like a quick overview. So you have one from Malik, for instance. So Malik is a persona, so a theoretical representation of a user based on data. So we did a lot of research talking to people who were blind, people who had severe visual limitations in that sense, and used screen readers. People who qualified sort of that profile. And then looked at all the challenges that they were facing and gathered all that information, looked at the rules that are out there for accessibility and said, what if we created 5 do's, 5 don'ts? So that, like, what would you look at if you want to create something that works better for someone who's blind? So the first page is this big image of the person, blindness, accessibility, do's and don'ts. Whoops. Not using this often, really clearly. And then the second page, actually the first page at the bottom will have, because personas typically will have examples of character traits and things like that to flesh them out a little bit so they feel a bit more human. So in this case, Malik, Malik. So personality, careful, organized, pragmatic. Demographics, 28 years old, open relationship teacher. So we get a sense of who that person is. And then the needs on the web would be meaningful heading structures, we talked about that. Semantic values and source code, so using the proper code elements. And then programmatic form associations. If I'm using a form, for instance, and I get into a form field, I would like to know that you're asking for my phone number, or my credit card number, or my name. If you don't tell me, how would I possibly know? So he needs things like that. And then frustrations might be related to websites and applications that are not compatible with the screen reader, and content that depends purely on site. So that gives you a context, like this is what Malik would require. The second page is where it gets really interesting, where we'll look at the possibilities of things that you should do or should never do. And then we're going to have things like, you should always describe linked images and images that convey information with brief, meaningful text alternatives. So there should always be something that describes images that actually carry information. But you should never embed meaningful information through images without offering these text alternatives. So we give you, again, things to think about, things to avoid.
Sorry.
Yeah?
Is this way itself accessible?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So the documents are PDF documents. They were tagged to be accessible. So they're fully consumable using assistive technologies. And yes, are accessible in that sense. Yeah, for sure. Another example here would be support content in the pages with properly coded section headings and meaningful link text. We talked about that too. And the thing you should never do is use section headings that are purely visual or vague link text that leaves the audience guessing. So things we talked about, basic things. But we have that. We have one like that for blindness, and then we had 11 more that are going to be about different roles. So I'm just going to show that to you real quick as we have to finish soon. But we have someone like Cindy for a mobility impairment, so someone in a wheelchair. We have deafness with Brian. Kind of weird rendering here. I'm not really sure why, but that one for someone who is deaf. Sorry. And then we have dyslexia with Lenny. We have colorblindness with Matt. We have autism with Nikki. Low vision with Rakesh. We've got anxiety with Ying. Vestibular disorders with Jason. ADHD with Joyce. Aging with Kim. And then photoepileptic sensitivity with Lynn. So you've got 12 of those. So again, it's a great way for you to understand some concepts around, like, what am I supposed to do? If someone has autism, or if someone has anxiety, what can I do in my design or my content to make it a little better for them? This document does this. And then the other document that I shared with you is, so I'll put the link back right after, but it's this document here that I presented at the beginning. It's this here. You can download that here, and you'll get 2 PDF files in that zip file. I'll put it back in a second. The other document, because we have to go, is similar, do's and don'ts again, but in this case, it's when you're speaking to people. Like, what are the things that you should be thinking about so that your delivery is inclusive? As an example earlier, I was talking about that table, and if you'll remember, I was describing every single column. Most of you can see them. Some of you may be wondering, why are you describing this? I can see them. Not everybody can. So if you want to make sure that people can follow, you would visually describe those things. I'm using a microphone. My voice carries to begin with. We probably would not need it, but because we have captions happening, it's required. If we had someone in the room that had a hearing impairment, they may have struggled hearing me. Chances are they were hearing me better now because I'm using this. But a lot of people would just tell you, I don't need this, like my voice is loud. But there's an accessibility consideration in there as well. And there's, again, dozens and dozens and dozens of things that you can do to make your presentation more inclusive.
So any kind of presentation, PowerPoint, anything for this file, right?
Right?
We can use this file to learn about any language.
That's the goal. The idea is to use something like this. So again, if I just show you real quick, and there's 8 of them here. So this particular document is similar. You've got different types of personas. And then, for instance, you'd have someone like Izumi here, who has dyslexia. And then for dyslexia, you'd have a certain number of things to think about. Like, for instance, well, let me get a little bigger again. So, always minimize the text on the screen and consider more visually engaging, compelling ways to tell your story. Because too much text is going to be hard. Or never use massive, high-straining blocks of text that can feel both off-putting and daunting for most people. And if you align to that in your PowerPoint, for instance, people are not going to be reading like this big paragraph on the PowerPoint. They'll be relying on you telling things anyway. Because I know, and some of you might know as well, but when I put this on the screen, like that, 1, it's a lot of words. 2, I'm talking, you're not listening to me, you're reading right now. So why am I talking? So fewer text, and then just going through the motion in a way where it goes from me to this, back to me. But if I put this, I'm in competition with my own content.
The content, so the content will be more dominant, and you will be less.
Right. Yeah, because this is like I'm curious. What is this really? So whatever I'm saying right now, people are just looking at this, and maybe you want to see what the next picture looks like. So you're waiting for that, and you're not really listening to me right now. Well, not that picture, but you're not. What you want to see is maybe something that, anyway. You get the idea. Like, I mean, you want to see that dude, for instance, and like, okay, so what is that about? Like, what's his disability? You're not listening to me as I'm doing that. So it's working through that because it's one thing for you to create content. It's another thing for you to deliver that content to your audience. So how can you maximize your content by paying attention to those things? So that's what this does. So in a summary, because we're over time, yeah, we are. So as a summary, you have a resource that gives you all the details about what accessibility is about, by roles, and you've got 2 documents that give you 1, things to consider for a particular disability, and then another resource that tells you what to think about if you want to deliver that content to someone who has that disability. So I feel like the 3 of them together are a very complete resource to help you learn about those things. All of them are about very specific things to think about, and my suggestion is pick whatever you want in there, start with that, and progressively build to some kind of an expertise around that topic. Don't try to do all of this in one day. Just go progressively through that, and hopefully that helps you.
Can we make a compare and contrast between the different kinds of people? Because as we learn progressively, as you're saying, about different kinds of people and their needs, can't we end up comparing and creating sort of diagram, maybe something on live?
Well, you could. I mean, the question is, can we sort of compare all of this and then bring it into something visual
Yeah.
that would give you a broader vision? I don't have that.
I know you don't,
But if you want to create that, you know, it would be great. But you know, that might be the next logical step, is to say, okay, so visually, how do I translate this into something that's a bit more digestible for some people? And maybe that's a great resource to add to this. But you know, the idea is to just help demystify some of that content. I'm gonna stop there because we've got people waiting in the hallway. Thank you. I hope this was relevant and useful. If you have any questions, I'm around, so just come say hi.
Thank you.
Good night.